Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about intros and conclusions. These are probably the two things that I get the most questions about. And so let's jump right in. Basically, long story short, papers are typically written to be skimmed, meaning that we need the most important information to be in the spots where a reader's looking for them. And so this is the order that you would read and when you're skimming a paper or a book, a nonfiction like academic type book. And so let's go ahead and look at then what the introduction, what kind of the parts of the introduction are so that we can know where to have that information. You've probably heard with an introduction, sorry, my chair is making all kinds of sounds. With an introduction, you want to start with a hook. I actually usually refer to this as a net because when we're thinking of a hook, we're thinking of fishing, we're trying to reel in a fish, right? But typically what you really want to do with an introduction is you want to start with a sentence that appeals to as many readers as possible. That's why I like a net, because you're catching more than one fish, hopefully. And so you want to start with something, it could be like an interesting fact. It could be something that's like a quote from somebody in the documentary or podcast that you're doing. And it can also be something that's just like, why is this relevant to you? You know, it could even be something as generic as true crime is a very big topic right now. And so a lot of people are interested in true crime. It could be something like this scammer recently went to prison, convicted of fraud. And so this is a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. So it's like it's more specific to your topic. It's up to you, but what you want to try and do with this is appeal to as many readers as possible to make them think this paper might be interesting to me, right? In the middle of the introduction, you're going to have just a little bit of background information. I'd really encourage you to keep your summary short at this point and try to have a summary paragraph following the introduction, because what's trending right now, and this has been for a while, so it's not like this year, but what's been trending lately is having shorter introductions and getting into, you know, the summary and things like that after you've already said your thesis statement. And so I would just encourage you to kind of think that way. All right, and then your last sentence of your introduction should be, or you know, maybe last two sentences should be your thesis statement. And don't forget, we do have a thesis formula for this paper. And so hopefully your thesis statement is pretty easy to write. If you're having any kind of trouble or confusion with writing the thesis statement, please let me know. I have some suggestions here for things to avoid when writing your introduction. I'd say the ones that I find the most are going to be book review introductions where you're just giving a bunch of facts, like especially if you're giving a super long summary, it can get kind of boring at that point. The writer is like, or the reader is trying to figure out like, okay, but what is the argument you're going to make? What are we talking about? And so that's why I encourage you to have that summary in the paragraph below. And then the other thing is a Webster's definition, right? Like any kind of dictionary definition, because it's been done so many times, it just feels a little cliche. And so I would recommend not doing that. Quotes can be great as long as they're a specific person related to the documentary or podcast. So just keep that in mind. I have some suggestions here, but let me know if you have any questions about any of these. All right, tips for your introduction. Something that can be really good is to include like a surprising detail, fact, definition, or quote that you found doing your research. If it was interesting to you, then that can be a great way to start your introduction. And so I have some other tips here that could be useful. Now, I want to talk about the conclusion. Your conclusion is going to be structured almost exactly the opposite of your introduction. And I forgot to mention this, but when we look at the introduction, we're going from as broad as possible with that hook or that net, and then you're getting to your specific argument with the thesis statement. Now, with a conclusion, we're going to have as specific as possible to start, and then you're broadening out. Okay, so when you're starting your conclusion, you typically want to have a restated thesis. Your main point that you're making, your argument, you state that at the beginning of the conclusion, reminding the reader of the point that you've made throughout. And then you want to just broaden it out. And so I have some suggestions in here of things to do, but the main goal here is to answer the question, so what? Okay, you want to try to avoid just summarizing what you've already said in your paper, especially because these papers are pretty short. It doesn't take very long to read. And so your reader very likely has not forgotten everything that they just read. It's probably only taken about 10 minutes to read. It's just not long enough to have forgotten. Try to avoid words like in conclusion or to conclude. In my opinion, I believe, I think. So these are kind of linguistic things. But the big thing to kind of keep in mind with a conclusion is you're answering the question, so what? The reader has now read the paper, they've learned all of this information, and now they're trying to figure out what to do with this information. Okay, so when you're thinking far ahead to like or maybe even now, when you're in your career, when you're doing research in your field, people who are reading your work are typically trying to understand how should this affect their practice and how should it affect their research. I read educational research a lot, like research from other teachers and scholars, trying to figure out the best way to teach, and different assignments to teach and things like that. And so I'm not reading just for the sake of reading. I'm reading because I'm trying to answer a question. How should I teach this assignment, or how should I update my practices, right? And that's going to be the same for doctors and other people, lawyers, people in other fields who are just trying to figure out, okay, what is the best way to do this practice? And then researchers are giving them suggestions. But it can also be more general than that. You can sometimes have people who are just trying to learn about this topic. So you can also just try to relate it to the larger context of, society or whatever. Perhaps it could be related to, if you're looking at scams, for example, how scams are able to grow, through situations like COVID, for example, like in that John Oliver video we watched. That's relevant to today, as we're looking back on 2020. And you could also talk about things like regulation and how laws have changed, to kind of get people interested in how this subject might change over time, right? Like if there's a court case right now related to fraud, then that might be interesting to mention in your conclusion. All right. I hope this was helpful. I hope that you're feeling confident writing an introduction and conclusion. I think my biggest tip is try not to overthink it. You can always get creative and think of something spectacular later if you feel inspired. But really, the goal here is just to tell the reader why this subject's important, and then what your argument is, and then what they should do with the information that you've just shared with them. Okay. And as long as you've done those three things, you should be good. All right. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good day.